Senator Rand Paul, thank you for joining us.
Glad to be with you.
What's the status of the stimulus vote, and what is your take on how much stimulus should be voted on?
You know, I think it's unlikely that there'll be any kind of more bailout money given to people before the election. The problem from my perspective is, you know, there is no money in Washington. There's no savings account or rainy day fund. We can't kind of go over to the Federal Reserve and open a big safe and, oh, here's all this money we'll give to people. So I have not been in favor of borrowing more money. I think the way to rescue the economy is you have to open the economy. This is a self-inflicted recession/depression. The jobs lost and the businesses closed came from government edict. So the way you reverse that is by getting rid of the government edicts. We need to let people go back to eating in restaurants, going to movie theaters, going out and having a good time. Those who are at high risk should take precautions. Those who have either had the disease or are at low risk should make their own choices.
But with the numbers continuing to rise, people are saying that more and more people should stay home, that we're in another surge. I'm doing a story right now talking about how the numbers are spreading out of Cincinnati into northern Kentucky and Dearborn County. What's your answer to that?
The interesting thing is you look at these curves, and Spain is a good example of this. Spain had a peak back in the spring when New York did and when Italy did, and there was a peak in incidence of disease and then the peak in deaths. The deaths came down, and right now they have a peak in new cases and have had it for a month or two, but no increase in deaths. So the extraordinary things is people getting an infection and not being sick should not be something that we sort of say, oh, we got to lock down the economy for. The death rate is not rising. If you look at New York or New Jersey, you're starting to see a little upswing of new infections, but virtually zero deaths. It's along the x-axis. If you look at Sweden, they're having a little bit of rise of new cases. So is France, so is UK. But the death numbers are still down on the x-axis. So the good news is it may be that the spring was the worst time for this, that the new cases aren't going to be elevated death rates, and that actually people are going to ultimately over time develop enough immunity that we can live with this disease in a relatively or less difficult fashion, you know, that we dealt with in the spring.
I talked to Senator McConnell on Tuesday, and he said he was bringing a $500 billion bill to the floor. I know what you just said, but are you in favor of passing that? Will you vote for that?
That did come to the floor, and it was unanimously rejected by the Democrats, so it didn't pass. I don't know that it'll come up again, but I've been of the opinion that we shouldn't borrow more money, that the answer should be opening the economy. So Kentucky's economy is suffering because of one man. Governor Beshear unilaterally, with no consultation to the legislature, with no consultation to anyone else, basically shut our economy down. So 700,000 Kentuckians being out of work, our restaurants devastated, our hotels devastated, our racing industry and all of our other venues decimated. This is all at the hands of one person. What we should have done is we should have been realistic as to who this virus affects and who it doesn't affect. Young people under age 25, the mortality rate is 1 in a million. This is less than the seasonal flu. For older people, it's the reverse. It's much more serious than the seasonal flu and has a much higher mortality. We should have been protecting those who are vulnerable instead of taking this approach that we're going to lock the entire economy down. If you compare us to Sweden, we've had these massive lockdowns and massive unemployment. Sweden did very little of that. They don't wear the masks, they've had their bars open, and Sweden's death rate per million is actually less than the U.S. now. We have about 680 per million. They have about 580 per million. So really the question is, you know, people feel like, oh, we got to do something, and they're wringing their hands. But I'm not sure that the lockdown affected anything. We have a higher death rate than countries that didn't do the lockdown. That should make us rethink our strategy. And particularly since there's no increase in the death rate right now, and the death rate is very low, I think we really, really should keep the economy open. If anything, we need to open the economy further.
Just to push back on that with two minor points. One is that, I know Governor Beshear did do that, but he was doing it at the instruction of the CDC and the White House at the time. And then secondly, Sweden has, I've read some stories where Sweden has rethought its approach because they are seeing a major surge there. Maybe not in deaths, like you said, but in serious cases and hospitalization.
I think it's important to distinguish between people getting COVID positive, which doesn't even really mean you can't even really say they're getting sick. probably 100,000 students or more have gotten this now. The vast majority are positive, but not even getting sick. So to say that that is some sort of end of the world dilemma misstates the facts. They're not getting sick at all. And in fact, right now we don't have a choice, but as these young people are getting sick, they're actually providing immunity for the rest of the community. Like it or not, we are developing and heading towards herd immunity until we get a vaccine. Not by choice, just that is what is happening. But I think we should really put into context that the surge in infections has not led to a surge in deaths. Opening our schools has not led to a surge in deaths, but the governor made these decisions unilaterally without any input from the state legislature. Now, the CDC didn't actually give advice on actually shutting down the businesses. There may have been some guidelines or whatever, but this was Beshear's decision to shut down businesses. And the hypocrisy of Beshear is paramount when you see that Beshear was having more people at his press conferences than he was letting gather anywhere else in the state. He was saying no more than 10 people can gather. You'd see 20 people at his press conferences every day. So, you know, what's good for the gander is good for the goose. I think that we need to really allow a much more broad spectrum of our representatives make these decisions, and allowing decisions for the entire economy to be made by one person, that's more in line with the Soviet Union than it is with America.
Now, one more question on the stimulus package. After I interviewed Senator McConnell, a report came out that he said he was actually not in favor of any deal, and he was trying to keep the White House and Congress from reaching a deal. Have you heard anything about that? Can you comment on that?
No, I've not heard any intent not to have a deal. I think they've all been working back and forth for a deal, but no, have not heard of anybody trying not to have a deal.
Okay. Moving on, the Judicial Committee, as you know, passed Amy Coney Barrett today. What's your stance on her? And when it comes to the full floor, what's your vote going to be there?
You know, I'll vote to confirm Amy Coney Barrett. I met with her last evening. I think she's a very thoughtful woman. I think she doesn't have a political agenda. I think she's an intelligent woman. I think she's a woman of faith and of character. And I think all of those things are important. And I think she's a wonderful pick for the Supreme Court, and I will vote to confirm her.
What do you say to the Democrats who say that this, they boycotted the vote today, and then they said that they should have held off until after the election?
Well, I wasn't one of those who said that the reason we were against Merrick Garland had anything to do with elections or end-of-the-year politics. Some people said that, but many of us simply said that whoever's in the majority in the Senate, they get to decide whether to give their consent or withhold their consent. I withheld my consent for Merrick Garland because I didn't think he was a good pick for the Supreme Court, and we were in the majority, so our numbers won. So I think it's simply whoever's in the majority, and that the president's term doesn't end in 3 years and a half or 3 years and 3/4. The president term goes through the entire term. And I think any Democrat who would say that they wouldn't have approved a justice in the last month of a term of a Democrat is being disingenuous.
Anything else you wanted to talk about that I didn't bring up?
No, just that I think that people need to be hopeful, and we need to not be so doom and gloom about this. The economy is recovering. We do need to open it up, but we're a resilient nation. We're a wealthy nation because of capitalism, because of freedom, because of low taxes and less regulation. We shouldn't forget about that. I really think that we're going to get through this, and it needs to be less about somebody causing the problem. This was a natural phenomenon, and I think we overreacted to it, and the public policy was bad. But the disease itself and the deaths and the people who died, really, this is a Mother Nature kind of thing that's not easily explained as far as pinning hopes. But it's not a Republican or Democrat problem. I think we can pull together, and I really do think that a bit of optimism is due, particularly with all the immunity that we now have in our country, and also that the death rate is very, very low, and I think we shouldn't forget that.
Senator, thank you very much for spending some time with us.
Thank you.